There we go. Okay. So I want to start with eyewitness testimonies. Just thinking about both Perry and the lecture that I gave. The question about excluding testimony, I think that's the sort of most concrete question that I asked, and that's asked in Perry, but it's a really difficult thing to talk about because it provides the possibility of excluding these really egregious examples, but it also maybe gives the judge too much power. This is something that Marcus mentioned, actually. And so there are a couple rules that people have suggested for excluding or including testimony. I think Ivan brought up excluding uncorroborated testimony. So not including testimony that has no other corroboration, either from other eyewitnesses or some sort of other evidence that might prove this. So that's one thing that's been suggested, hasn't been taken up. And many lean towards I think it was like Annie, Michaela, Davis, Ada, and Cynthia all talked about only excluding evidence if it's obviously falsified or illegally obtained. And really it depends on if we want to err on the side of less evidence if we're not sure it's correct, or if we want to allow evidence that might be misleading and then rest on the defense to convince juries that eyewitness testimony can be misleading or mistaken. But I wanted to break this issue down into a couple parts. So there's the issue of reliability. Obviously, we know that it's often inaccurate or partially inaccurate. Because of that, it can't be said to be reliable at all, because we don't know. I think Pranay pointed out there's no way to know if evidence is reliable or not. This eyewitness testimony is reliable or not. There's no way to test someone's memory. And in the way that you could have sort of DNA evidence sent out to another testing facility and to see if they can corroborate it, there's no way to test whether or not this is reliable. So at best, it's unreliable. It may be accurate, but it may also not be accurate. But then sometimes it's the only evidence we have, or it can be really important evidence. So we're left kind of with a really valuable piece of evidence whose reliability we have no way to gauge. So it's really a problem. Another thing that came up was the language of interrogation. You all noticed the problems with the leading questions in my questionnaires. But there's also the fact that in some cases it led you to get it right? Like if you got the question about, was the woman wearing white? Was the man gardening? You were more likely to actually get that right. So you can see why an officer who believes he knows what happened might ask what are kind of leading questions, because it might lead you to get it right. So the idea of having objective language in questioning, which I think a bunch of people brought up, is kind of difficult, but also it's difficult to say exactly what objective language would be. And then also it might not lead to as much eyewitness testimony as we have now. When you guys think about objective, what are you, objective language in interrogation, what sort of questions are you thinking of?
Where were you on this stage? You have an alibi. It's just direct asking you for a question in that one.
Okay, so if you were asked, where were you on this day, would you then assume that that day was important?
Yes.
That's true. Well, maybe they could just be asking, that's when the crime happened, and they're I'm kind of out of breath because I was doing jumping jack.
Good for you, staying active.
Yeah, they could just, if that's the known date that the crime happened, it makes sense for them to ask that.
Yeah, it makes sense, but The thing I'm saying
Mhm.
is there's a difference between asking questions in a language that makes sense and asking questions
Mhm.
in a sort of objective
Okay.
way. And yeah, I was wondering what you guys thought, like an objective question about some of these like examples in the experiment might be.
I was thinking about so objective questions might just asking you about the facts, like what you see, or like this man cross the street or not, instead of do you think the man crossed the street he actually have intentions to like rob a bank or something. So I was thinking like objective questions is like more based on the facts and like it's not really asking you to make deductions about the situation.
Okay. Okay,
Yeah.
so just about sort of the details of what happened.
Yes.
So then was my question about was the woman holding a martini glass? Is that suggestive or is it objective?
That's subjective. 'Cause that's like specific. You should say what was the woman holding, or if was the
Okay.
woman holding anything,
What
and
yeah,
like
so now we're sort
yeah.
of going back out like was she holding a martini glass? What was she holding? Was she holding anything?
Mm.
What was she doing? It's it's hard to say at which sort of level of remove we should
Uh-huh.
we should stop.
Mhm.
Because if you really are trying to understand what she might have been holding, then asking something like what was she doing might not get you the information you were looking for. um,
Mhm.
I'm just trying to demonstrate that there are different definitions of objective when it comes
Right.
to these questions, and we are trying to find a way to ask factual questions, but they always end up sort of running up against what we think, what we're expecting to hear, and what that person has in their mind. And those are going to be sort of separate things. Like the police have an idea of what they think happened or have something that they're trying to figure out. And then the person has their memory.
Mhm.
Um, but when they come into contact with each other, you end up getting sort of unexpected combinations, like suggesting that the woman was holding a martini glass, which she didn't even look like she was. She was clearly
Right.
holding her sunglasses. Um, and this kind of gets to the question of like how the jury receives it. Do you guys think if you were on a jury, um, you weren't taking this class, um, and someone came on the stand and said, I saw it happen, how do you feel like you would react to that? Do you think you could be convinced that what they saw wasn't actually what they saw?
I guess it depends on the situation.
Okay. Can you say more?
Like, I don't know if it was a dark night. I don't remember, like,
Mm-hmm.
for the videos they were kind of like there was a guy going through a building. That one I guess I would believe, but if it was night out and you saw someone, I would be more skeptical, I think.
Mhm.
Like
Did you?
if you yeah, you go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, did you get every detail of the videos correct?
Oh no, absolutely not. I didn't even remember there was a woman. Like the question, there was a second question. And I'm like, what? When did we see this? Yeah, so um, but they wouldn't be testifying if they had nothing, right? I would hope.
Wouldn't be testifying if they had
Like
Nothing.
if they were like me and they didn't even remember the woman, they probably wouldn't testify. I guess. I hope.
I mean, if they were there and they saw it happen,
Okay.
like you're going to have holes in your memory. You're not going to remember everything. So I don't think that would be a reason that they would exclude testimony just because you forgot there was a woman there.
I guess
Mhm.
then it's the job of the defendant's attorney to really ask you what you saw, and then the jury can judge whether or not you saw anything. Or like if you
Yeah, I guess I'm asking, like, as the jury, would you guys be convinced that this person didn't actually see
I
what
don't
they
know
say
if
they saw?
I'd be convinced, but I would probably be swayed if there wasn't any other type of evidence. So if
Mhm.
that's your main evidence, like you have to take it into some kind of consideration. Because
Okay.
as the jury, I mean, staying in that room for however long, you're like, okay, we just got to decide something. And if
Mhm.
that's the only thing you have to go off of,
Yeah, a little bit similar to having that lineup and being like, well, this is what I have, so
hmm
I should probably pick something.
And it's funny because in the like experiment thing, I was like, I had an image of what the guy looked like,
Hmm.
and I was like, which one of them matches my memory the most? Because I was like,
Yeah,
I'm not sure if they look like him, but let's look for the one that looks like him the most. So
yeah.
that's yeah.
I mean, that is exactly what that eyewitness,
hmm
the case that I talked about from the Innocence Project. That's exactly what she said. She said, "Who looked closest to
Yeah.
the man I had in my mind." Um,
hmm
yeah, which is, of course, what you would do, right?
Right.
When you're being asked to make a decision about this. So that also puts us in a little bit of a pickle because we're more. I would think that we would want to include eyewitness testimony, especially if it's the only test, like if it's the only evidence that we have.
hmm
But then we might also be more likely to trust it if it's the only evidence that we have. Um, but it being the only evidence that we have does not make it more reliable, right?
Yeah.
So, um, and I think that a couple of people brought this up in the comments that like I think Nathan talked about having like this gut feeling of like, well, I saw it, so um, if someone says, well, memory is unreliable and this woman could really feel like that's the person she saw and that could not be true, it kind of attacks our own sense of our own memory and feels like an attack on our own memory that 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 the defense attorney would be doubting the witness's memory, because it's very difficult for a jury to hear like I saw it happen and then doubt that. And I think all of this kind of get to an essential problem of testimony itself. Um, a lot of you talked, and we were just talking about like this impulse to fill in the gaps when you um, can't remember or when you're asked to remember something that is not there. Um, I think this is sort of essentially a narrative impulse, right? Because stories shouldn't have holes. Stories should be complete. And so if there's a hole in the story, there must be something to fill in. And obviously the problem with eyewitness ID is that sometimes the holes are just there. You know, the person is not in the lineup. We actually can't tell if there was a passenger in the car. But narratives don't like holes. And so if you're being asked to tell a story of what you saw happen, you are just sort of instinctively going to try to string it together without holes, even if your memory has those holes. Because real events aren't narratives in and of themselves. We make the narratives about the events. So I wish I had a solution to sort of wrap this up with, but I think eyewitness testimony is a really difficult thing because it is unreliable, but it's such an important piece of evidence, and it's not something you can really hear and distrust. Yes, Sash.
So is the eyewitness testimony, is this like done in person at the court or trial, like spoken by the eyewitness themselves?
Usually, yeah.
So I was thinking that it might be better just have like a written record of it, of their thing, and present that rather than the actual eyewitness. So I think it kind of goes back to just like what you were saying before. If someone's like, I saw it and I was there, I would, if I was on the jury, going back to your original question, like, I mean, yeah, they saw it, probably happened. Yeah, okay, sounds good. You know,
Yeah.
unless it's blatantly, they're like, I think maybe something, you know, if
Yeah.
it was really like, obviously they didn't remember, then of course I would doubt it naturally. But if it was all other things equal, like we would accept it. And a lot of times there are these horrible crimes. And this
Mm-hmm.
person like, this happened to me, you wouldn't be like, nah, sorry, your
Nah, it
memory
didn't.
sucks. It doesn't matter, I don't care, sorry.
Yeah.
So like, I think it would be better to have, because then when you have a record and it's read usually monotonously by like some lawyer or something, you're not going to have that same personal connection.
Hmm.
Like oh, I'm doubting this person who's this horrible things happen. It's more of, well, he says that she said sort of
Mhm.
thing. So like you're removing that layer of like personal connection to the eyewitness.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really interesting suggestion because then it removes the personal connection and it gets rid of the problem. Maybe not entirely, but it partly gets rid of the problem of you feeling like personally attacked about having someone's
Yeah, yeah,
memory doubted. Um, and it's also possible that in that case you could go back to the original witness testimony rather than the one
exactly.
they give in court. Because there's also the problem that obviously years usually have passed in between seeing it and giving the testimony. And so by that point, really your memory is just the story that you tell yourself. Like my memory from years ago is just the important things that I've sort of made stories about in my head.
Yeah,
I don't actually remember like
and
random
like
details.
and like in your lecture, you talked about the one case, the original testimony of the lady who was assaulted. I think she originally had one story, and then she changed it later.
Hmm.
So if it changes, then you just sort of invalidate all of it because the jury doesn't know what the actual thing is, like
Yeah.
what's the real memory or not.
I
Yeah.
honestly feel that sometimes it's not even that the memory changes, is that the prosecution or whoever like somehow, make you think that if you deliver it this way, then it'll be more believable, and that the defendant's more likely to, be um be found guilty or something like that.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And if you are the victim if you're the victim and the eyewitness, then
Mm,
you want a conviction. And
yeah.
if your lawyer is telling you, well, if you say I only saw him for a second, then no one's really going to believe your testimony. Didn't you see him for a little longer than that? And so then you could go back and revise that. And it may not even be like intentionally falsified. It might just be sort of a process of convincing yourself that something went differently. We all have the experience of remembering something incorrectly and going back and sort of revising it later, especially in traumatic situations, I would think. Yeah, Sash.
And I think, and I was going to talk about this in my forum post, but then I decided not to keep on going. But like, I think part of this stems from the fact that, what was the term? I think it was adversarial system.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like it's almost like a fight, like trying to win rather than find the truth.
Mm-hmm.
So I think in that case, like someone who, if I imagine, like if I experience some extreme crime, I wouldn't mind. I would think to myself, this person's a criminal. There's no doubt about it.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to think maybe it was someone else, but it's this person needs to be punished, needs to be put in prison. So, it's okay if maybe actually my memory was a different way, or maybe this did happen, because to you, you're just, like you were saying, you're just trying to justify that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's some sort of combination of everything. And like the defense lawyer may not believe their clients. That's not a prerequisite for defending them. So it may happen that the defense lawyer gives inadequate counsel, or will also try to stretch the truth or try to sort of frame things in the best way in order to win for their client. Yeah, it is sort of an essential issue. Yeah, Peter.
Yeah, because I was thinking like in this sort of adversarial system, the eyewitnesses have to be confronted by the defense attorneys.
Mm-hmm.
So like by repeating asking the eyewitnesses questions, I mean like an eyewitness, if he or she does not have a really solid grasp of her memory, she could easily like false statements, because like something that might happen like years ago she couldn't really remember. So I was thinking maybe it's better for them to just it's better for eyewitnesses not to make, it's okay for them not to string their memories into a full story. Instead, I was thinking when they're giving their testimonies, we could separate them. I kind of agree with what Sash said, to make that into sort of a written document instead of putting them actually onto the court.
Mm-hmm.
So if you actually have that down, that would be so it was actually written down, so it wouldn't really be swayed by the defense attorneys.
Mm-hmm.
And I was also thinking in terms of the questions asked to the eyewitnesses. it should be sort of like a gradual process. For example, like asking whether the woman was holding a martini glass, we should like start with, okay, do you remember, did she hold anything or not? And the eyewitness can say yes or no. And if she actually said yes, and then we can proceed to like, okay, so do you remember exactly what she was holding? And if she said yes again, and she could answer, well, it's a martini glass or a sunglass. If she doesn't really recall, then you can give it like a sort of line of things. Okay, so do you think she held up like a martini glass, sunglasses, or several stuff like for her to pick it up? So this way we could sort of try to maximize the sort of objectivity in the sort of in terms of giving eyewitness testimonials, I guess.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
definitely, like, I feel like the main point is, like for eyewitnesses, there's definitely not necessary for them to just try to piece their testimonies into like a whole story. You just have to give what you remember, like most accurately. Like for things you're not really sure, just don't blurt it out.
Yeah. The difficulty is how we instruct eyewitnesses not to blurt it out. I'm sure that all of you, when you were doing this sort of experiment, were trying not to give false testimony, right? You're not trying to lie. And I wasn't pushing you, and there was no prosecution riding on this. And still you might have been misled by some of my choices. Yeah, Angela.
If it's okay for me to add on a little bit about the written testimonies.
Yeah.
When I was reading the case brief for Miranda versus Arizona, I thought one of the most, I think, interesting things that they wrote about was how the environment and atmosphere of like an interrogation is inherently going to be really stressful, and that might affect how the defendant acts. And so I think if you have the opportunity to do a written testimony, then you have like more time to think about what actually happened, and like, I guess theoretically you could be under less stress, so there's a chance that maybe what you write is less likely to be exaggerated or skewed. Yeah.
So we're actually sort of tending towards using the questionnaire that I gave you guys, which maybe is less likely to get wrong answers, but it still did get wrong answers, right? And I think you're right that the sort of environment is kind of inherently coercive, and it's very difficult to remove that from any of this, because it's always going to be the police investigating, and the police always have authority over you. So it's always going to be somewhat coercive or under pressure. Yeah, Saj.
Just going back to all this writing and putting things together, I would imagine it's sort of like a synthesis of what Peter was saying, what Angela was saying as well from there. Almost as if they're like FRQs. So like at the beginning, it's just sort of what happened, and then you go into more specific things. Because whenever you give someone so many options, it's almost masking the subjectivity in just the mass of things. So you're not saying, was it a martini glass or sunglasses? Because then you would think, okay, I think one of these has to be important. But if it was one of these 30 things, then whatever you choose, it's going to be more based on memory rather than what you think should be the right answer.
Okay, so basically bigger lineups is what you're saying. Like,
yeah,
like not just 6 people, it should be like 30 people. I mean, they do, it has been shown that like it's more accurate if you have someone flipping through a book full of pictures, in which they're sort of just like looking page after page after page, and they have a lot of options. They're much less likely to identify someone, and they're also much less likely to identify someone incorrectly. Yeah, Brian, you were saying.
You could also, if you emphasize that they don't have to pick one of the choices, I think it's helpful.
Yeah, that would be important. But from the police perspective, if you think you've got the guy in the lineup, you don't want to emphasize like, could be none of these guys.
Yeah, but it's also bad if they get exonerated later. So.
Yeah, I mean, the police don't actually care if you get exonerated later. It doesn't do anything to them. They don't get punished for finding the wrong person.
The individual people probably don't, but like over the long term, probably lowers trust, and then that's like bad for them.
Yeah.
They're doing their job.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, Saj.
In the exercise in the lecture, was there a particular reason why the actual suspect was not included in the lineup?
I think the point of that was, obviously this wasn't a video I created, but I think the point of that was to show that even when you obviously couldn't have identified someone in the lineup from your memory, you'll still pick someone. Like,
Oh yeah, okay, yeah.
I think the point was to show you that you will go back and revise your memory. And this is a problem, obviously. Usually with lineups, they have one person who they think is the suspect, and then they have fillers who are other people drawn usually from like other police or just people who happen to be in the station. So in that case, there's really, if you don't have the right suspect, then the suspect isn't in the lineup. They don't get usually 6 suspects together and have you choose between them. So it's actually very common that you would have a lineup without the suspect in it. So
I
that's,
feel like no matter how you present the eyewitness testimony, the jurors will still, like, if you have it written and like, let's say the prosecution reads it out loud or whatever, the jurors will still try to put it into perspective, and then next thing you know, they go into their own little worlds to see how it happened and stuff like that. So that would still sway them because, you know, there's still human emotion in
yeah,
the whole justice system. So
yeah. Well, in all of these things, we're sort of, the reason why I wanted to talk about reliability is that, like, this is an obviously flawed piece of evidence. Like, this, there's nothing we can do about that. We can't fix the problem of memory. So we can only sort of find approximations of something that could be a little bit better or a little more objective. But I think that's a sort of a paradigm shift in the way that we think about evidence, because we usually think of evidence as evidence, right? Evidence is clues which are connected to the solution. And in this case, we have to think about this evidence as like maybe evidence, but maybe not evidence, and try to think about how to integrate that into an argument in sort of the most fair way that we can. Because if something is presented as evidence, it's very difficult to then convince the jury that it might actually also not be evidence. It might be meaningless. Do you guys have any other final thoughts about eyewitness testimony? I feel like we could have a whole class on eyewitness testimony. It's really complicated.
Yeah, because I was just kind of surprised to see like how eyewitness testimonies can be so inaccurate. Like, so we had this spring breakthrough class about forensic psychology, and basically, as Professor John Blackshear, he told us actually a story happened in Durham, like I think it's 10 or 20 years ago. But apparently, there was this woman, and she was briefly raped when a black male barged into her house. And it was like for a very brief moment, like 15 seconds, 20 seconds. And her family's upstairs came to rescue, and the black male escaped. So it happened that the woman's husband is the local police officer. So she radioed to the rest of her colleagues, like, okay, so there was this black male, and her wife told her about the black male traits. So he told all her colleagues. And it was like after 10 minutes, one of his friends were actually patrolling in the neighborhood, and he found out there was like one black male who sort of fit the traits. So he directly brought that man to the victim's house. And so I don't think that was actually by the rules, because they didn't really do a lineups or something. But the victim directly testified. He said, okay, that is the man who raped me. But later there was like overwhelming evidence to suggest otherwise. So it was actually pretty interesting to see, like, even after like a 15 or 20 minute span, you can still identify the wrong guy.
Yeah, I think we generally think like the closer to the moment you get, the better your memory is going to be. But
exactly. So like we talk about maybe under that circumstances, like the woman is in fear, and also you got lighting and all the psychological like factors playing into effect. So it's like she could easily have like a revenge mentality. If you were given a chance to say, okay, I have a chance to pick out the perpetrator, so no matter if he's like the actual person or not, defeat the demographics, so probably I'll choose him, something like that.
Or a sense, or just like a sense in the moment that like you can't remember what
Yeah,
the
that's true,
person
though.
looked like, but you've been told that this person was picked up near your house and who fits the description.
Yeah, it's sort of like a
You might-
confirmation bias.
Yeah, you might, exactly. It's a little bit of confirmation bias and desirability bias. Like you do want to find the person, right? So there's that too. Yeah, Saj.
I think another problem is like, how do you describe traits in the first place? So
Mhm.
like, you're gonna be looking for someone, and if someone like matches one, like for example, in this case, African American male, if like there's not gonna be many probably like just walking around randomly at this time of the day, who knows, just
In the middle of the
coming
night
from
or
that area.
whatever, yeah.
Yeah. So if you see one, and it could be like someone just taking a walk or something, but if he's like, okay, there's that, and then the rest of it sort of blurs together. And I
Mhm.
think in one of the forum posts I saw, it's like people have trouble discerning between individuals of a different race from theirs.
Yeah, it's called cross-racial blindness, and
Yeah.
we have, this is like a very well documented problem, that you have difficulty distinguishing between people who are not of your race.
And like going back to the other thing about the closer you are to the time of the crime, the better your memory will be. I
Mhm.
think my memory's pretty good. Like I remember like all sorts of credit card numbers and phone numbers and like
Mhm.
20-digit things, whatever. But even in that video, after like 45 seconds, I couldn't identify the guy.
Yeah.
Because like in the video footage, like there were just like little shots of him here and there without any. I think if I like stared at his face for like 30 seconds, like it was just a picture of him in the screen, I would remember. But
Mhm.
I can't imagine how a person could accurately remember who the person was if, like, whenever there's like adrenaline and stuff, you're not like, okay, let me rationally just completely just take a full picture of his face and look at his features and stuff.
Yeah. And everybody has a different capacity to remember faces. Like I actually tend to not be very good at it. I've noticed this about myself over time. Like I'm just not very good at describing faces in particular. If someone was asking me to describe any of you, I know your faces very well, but I probably could not come up with any sort of description. And so we also have that problem that like we are differently good at translating visual into language. And so yeah, fits the description is it's very difficult to say. Yeah, and obviously it continues to be a problem because it's a very powerful piece of evidence. It's going to be very convincing. It's unknown. It's unprovable. Like it's just not reliable as evidence. In Five Little Pigs, the reason why I chose this to go with the eyewitness testimony is something that I think a lot of you started picking up on when we're talking about characters, that you really only see characters through the eyes of other characters. And so you don't really get a sort of bird's eye view in the way that you do with the Doyle stories. You just get these testimonies of, like, they're just interviews, right, that Poirot does with the suspects / characters. And you only get a sense of the other characters through their opinions of each other. So it is kind of all about eyewitnessing. Another thing that I thought was really interesting that you guys talked about is that is sort of the nature of clues. They were sort of more intangible and psychological, but I think Saj, you and Ada also pointed out Poirot is also very interested in the physical clues that he can get, right? But again, they're all sort of in the context of these interviews. They're all in the contexts of this eyewitness testimony. And this, I think, is a way that Christie is quite different from Doyle. Like Doyle, I think, believes more in the concept of objectivity than Christie does. I think Doyle, imagination lets Holmes achieve the perfect vision, but the perfect vision is in some way objective. and Christie allows things to be a little bit more subjective throughout. Even when we're sort of getting Poirot's comment on Amias's painting. So I gave you that quotation about sort of the riotous color of the flowers and things like that. You know, you're sort of getting the sense of Amias's extremity, how he's in touch with this sort of beautiful essence of things. But you also get a really strong sense that this is something that Poirot likes and admires about him. And if you don't like Amias, I think there is room for that. Like, I think there's room for the reader to kind of dislike Amias, even though Poirot has a kind of romantic vision of this artist and his sort of artistic nature. And Poirot kind of lets Amias off the hook. But I don't know, what do you guys think? Is there like breathing room to disagree with Poirot in Five Little Pigs? Like, to see characters differently than he does.
I think that makes it more interesting, because in the Doyle stories, it's whenever I'm going through it after any significant amount of time when you can begin to speculate, it's like, okay, how do these things fit together? Because you know they're going to be relevant, and you know that this is going to lead to the answer somehow in most cases. Mm-hmm. So thinking of, okay, you're just trying to get the one answer. But in this, based on the testimony, I know for myself at least, my perception of some of the characters changed as I read the different testimonies from each of the characters, and just seeing this character from different points of view. It wasn't even a standard view I had of one character. Mm-hmm. So it's like, okay, I don't know, now it could be this, now it could be this, I have no idea, it could be this. So I kind of like that more.
Yeah. What do you guys think? Do you feel like you were able to disagree with Poirot?
I never really had like one specific view, because it kept on changing.
Yeah.
So like at
For
sometimes
me, sorry.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, you can finish.
Oh yeah, at some points I'm like, wow, Amias is just this degenerate, just painting stuff and doing like animal things all the time. And then other times I'm like, oh, this is some hurt guy, you know, this is someone you need to help. So then, like, what am I supposed to do in that case? Like, he wouldn't kill himself, but actually, I don't know, maybe he would. So, I mean, it turns out that he didn't, but still, I never rule that out completely.
Okay. Neka?
For me, I kind of saw Poirot as the guide. You know, he was leading the sheep, and he was telling like, this is what happened, and he was meeting the people, and you know, just like, it was like you're in his mind, and you're doing the investigation with him, and you're like his rookie, per se. So I guess in that way, kind of, you know, I was waiting for Poirot to say something. I'd be like, oh, okay, that makes sense.
Okay.
So
you were his Watson, like.
Yes, exactly. So I guess that's the fun thing with detective stories, is that you can just, I guess, be with the detective and, you know, follow along with the case.
Yeah, you can definitely trust him. I did notice in, I think it was Mary's post, she was kind of angry about the lack of justice in the whole thing, because I think Five Little Pigs is interesting because Amias is such a like complicated character, and Poirot is quite generally, I would say, sympathetic to Amias. And so we're kind of led to also be sympathetic to Amias, but given who he is, it's also possible to have really strong feelings about him that do not line up with what Poirot feels, and to feel pretty suspicious of his, like, oh, you know, tortured artist, whatever, who just sleeps around and everybody forgives him for it. Especially his like long-suffering wife. So I feel like there's a little bit of room, but I think it probably depends on like how you come at the story. And
I think it was portrayed well.
Yeah.
And I could imagine, you know, what type of person Amias would be.
Yeah. He's really kind of alive, right? You can, I mean, despite being dead, obviously.
Yeah.
And,
also,
yeah, go ahead.
it goes to like what you want out of justice.
Mhm.
Because if you're like in the Doyle story about the butler who was like doing some rituals with a map or whatever that was in the treasure chest,
Yeah.
if you wanted like a dresser to fall on Elsa, you know, if that was your idea of justice, you know, you're just not going to get that because that would be too. It's like you have this complicated story of characters, and then all of a sudden, like a wardrobe falls on her. You know, it's just not really. It doesn't really fit in with what sort of story I would think. It would have to be
Yeah.
more because everything about it is psychological. So having her just living a tormented life, I guess that would be the most appropriate thing in this context.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. But if you're already inclined towards that kind of justice, it might be a little bit difficult that a dresser does not fall on her and she gets
Yeah.
away with it. And I mean, when in the thread about debts, many of you point out, you know, they're all punished in some way. Like Caroline pays her debt that she perceives towards her sister. Elsa has this unhappy life. Amias dies for his infidelity. And I thought Julia put it well. She said that, you know, the satisfaction doesn't come from the punishment. It comes from knowing all the pieces and
Right.
putting them all together at the end, which we do get satisfaction from, right? We know the whole story now, and it's all been kind of put out there. So in that way, Poirot is like, he doesn't punish or initiate punishment. He just tells the story of the punishment that already happened. And that's the justice, that we kind of get the whole story. And I guess we trust the story, right? Despite the fact that these are all eyewitness accounts, we end up trusting the story. Yeah, Nika,
Yeah.
did you?
I was just gonna say that I thought it was enough for, you know, me to uncover the truth, and Poirot was kind of like, here's the truth, here's what happened, and you can do with it what you will. And I was like, okay, good enough.
Yeah, Sasha, were you going to say something?
No, I don't have it anymore.
Well, I think there's like a other stories about Poirot make more of his Catholicism, but there's also like a little bit of a religious thing going on here because he's mostly investigating in England, which is not Catholic at this time, but he's Belgian and is Catholic, and the whole thing is a little bit sacramental in that way, like the sacrament of confession, which in Catholicism is basically, you know, you go to we've all seen movies, you go to the priest and you confess your sins, and the act of telling the sin absolves you from it because the priest sort of is a conduit to God, and that's what absolves the sin. So confession is supposed to kind of be purging, right? It literally kind of lifts the sin off of you. And Poirot here is just basically a confessor. He doesn't initiate any sort of investigation. He doesn't get the law involved. He doesn't say, okay, we should arrest Elsa or something like that. He just sort of gets the confessions out of everybody. And so there is a little bit of a religious satisfaction to it that's also going on. And the sort of, I think our religious, like Catholic idea of confession overlaps with our like colloquial sense of confession. You know, if you confess to doing something, like confess to wrongdoing to your parents or something like that, there's a sense that this will absolve you of it. Like if you've done something you're not supposed to do and you go and confess it to your parents, that's kind of supposed to end the guilt, right? Or like there might be a punishment or something like that, but the act of confessing it lifts it off your shoulders in some way. So there is satisfaction built into even our colloquial idea of confession. Or if you confess to a friend or anybody, there's a sense that it's supposed to like unburden you. Yeah.
also in line with that confession allegory, I guess, or rather motif throughout it, I've noticed that very specifically whenever the detective went to each of the people to ask them some questions and get their story, I noticed that she always made it very particular at the end to show in some way that they voluntarily wanted to do it. Other than like Philip, he's like, I'm busy, but I'll still do it. But like with his brother Meredith and like Elsa and all those people, they're like, no, I know it. I'll do this. I can do it. I'm voluntarily wanting to do this.
Yeah.
So that's more of like the confession idea, I guess.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that, but it's true that everybody kind of wants to tell their story in this, more or less. They all sort of want to share, and that fits much better with our idea of confession in the colloquial sense rather than the legal sense, right? In the legal sense, which is what we're going to be talking about in the coming weeks, you don't turn yourself into the police and ask to make a confession. There's usually some sort of interrogation that goes along with it before a confession happens. And it's obviously not the same consequences as a sort of confession in the colloquial or religious sense, right? Once you confess, you're fine. In these other senses, in the legal sense, once you confess, that's when you're screwed. So there are also different consequences to mixing up these different types of confessions. So that's kind of our bridge to the part that's coming next. Like, if I saw it happen is convincing to a jury, just imagine how I did it sounds to a jury. I think we automatically think of confession in this religious or interpersonal sense, in which you would have no reason not to tell the truth, right? You don't confess to your parents that you did something that you didn't do. But we do know that with legal confessions, there is such thing as false confessions. They do happen. And we run into a problem in the courtroom when we mix up these different types of confessions. So we're going to start with the rules of confession with Miranda and some of its important exceptions, Missouri and Oregon, and then we'll talk about, after that, we're going to talk about a couple famous false confessions and how those things happen. Yeah, Sash.
So everyone's entitled to counsel. So I've thought about this on several occasions. So what if it's like, okay, defense lawyer, I did this, but like, why are they still going to try to defend them, you know?
That's because that's their job.
Well, right, but like, what are they going to, I guess the better way to ask is like, wouldn't everything just be like a lie then? Like if they know that they did it and trying to show that they didn't do it?
Well, defense lawyers are allowed to lie. Everybody except for witnesses are allowed to lie.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And the police are allowed to lie to you when they're interrogating you, and like there's no burden of truth on any of this. So, I mean, it gets back to what you were saying about the adversarial system, that the point is to win, not to uncover the truth and like actually, or it is, but the adversarial system is a way of getting at that maybe is imperfect. Any last thoughts about Five Little Pigs, eyewitness testimony, questions about the course in general?
There was
yeah,
you can
Brian.
Go ahead.
So do you need, so people talked about a paper confession or like written testimony, I think. Is that even possible, or do you need to present your witness? Because otherwise, how would you know that person exists?
I mean, testimony, written testimony is sometimes admitted. In the case of written eyewitness testimony, I don't see why it wouldn't be admitted, because we allow written confessions and other types of written material. It is it is potentially a problem that you might want to like physically produce the witness. But I think there wouldn't be a problem with it. They generally do require that witnesses show up. But if we had a new rule that eyewitness testimony was going to be presented through written testimony, there are no sort of rules that would prevent that, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a good question. Written confessions are admitted all the time.
Do they check them for like?
Check them
like,
how?
Cause I mean, can I just get anyone to confess to anything, or like they must? Like if they're not in the same vicinity, can they confess to a random crime, basically?
I mean, the American system allows uncorroborated confessions. So yeah, you could
But
confess.
would that just end everything, or would they at least check if you could be there, like if you could possibly be there?
I mean, this is kind of one of the things that we're going to be talking about. It's pretty difficult for a jury to hear "I did it" and doubt that. So usually the confession is the nail in the coffin. Like if there's a confession, even if there's not other evidence. So I mean, this doesn't really give anything away, but the Scenes of a Crime documentary I'm trying to upload. It's about a man who is accused of killing his son, who his infant son, I think something like 4 months old, very young son, by hitting him against the crib. And he eventually confesses to this, and they make a video recording of his confession to this. And it turns out that the child didn't actually die from head trauma. The child died of an infection. But he was still convicted because he confessed. So,
Yeah, but did he do it, or did the child just not die from it even though he did it?
Well, there's no way to know whether or not he actually hit the child, but the child did not die of that. The child died of infection. So he was,
abuse.
what?
Still child abuse.
Something child abuse?
It's still child abuse because I mean, even if he died of infection.
But we don't actually know if he hit the child. So you'll get to see it. You can see the sort of the interrogation over time, because for the first sort of 16 hours or whatever, he insists that he didn't hit him. And then the police say, well, you could save him if you tell us what happened. Like the child is still alive, and you could save him if you told the doctors that you hit him, because then they would know how to treat him. And he does end up confessing to that. But the child was actually already dead at that point. And so he gives this confession, and it's unclear how much he believes actually took place. But the confession is convincing enough that even though the child didn't die of that, he was convicted. So
that is really suggestive. It's like you can save your son if you just say this. You're like, okay, I'll say it, to save your kid, but.
Yeah, so that's sort of that was eventually why why he was released many years later. But originally, I think to get to Braun's question, it's the confession really is a trump card. So generally, there doesn't have to be other corroborating evidence. And eyewitness testimony is not quite as much of a trump card, but it still does carry a lot of weight. Yeah.
I just have like a question about like researching. It's not even particular to anything, just research in general. So I imagine I'll have more than like one source. So like with law stuff, I noticed that I really like to write like a lot. and like each
Mhm.
source might be like 60 pages or something. And I mean, I'm interested, but I'm not trying to read like 800 pages for like an 8-page research report.
Uh-huh.
So what are some things to like extract essential information without having to go through everything?
Good question. The things I would do first are usually there's an abstract for the article. Read that. And read the introduction and the conclusion. And you can scan the sections and then only read the sections that are useful to you.
Okay.
Or you might read the abstract and be like, actually, no, this isn't going to be helpful, and just don't read it. I think for like close reading, you're really only going to close read a couple sources.
Like the whole source?
Yeah, like if you're
Okay.
writing about a case, you're going to read that case very carefully.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And if you're like, you'll probably read a couple secondary sources closely that like are useful to you. But you're right, not everything that you're going to come across you're going to read carefully. You can still cite, if your question is, can you still cite things that you have not read very carefully? Yes.
Okay.
People do it all the time. Little academic secrets. I have cited things I have not actually read, so.
Whoa.
Not like in depth. I've just sort of said like the primary works on this are A, B, and C, and like have not read those things.
You can even cite things to increase their citation counts.
Especially in science, I think that's like an important metric. Yeah.
They do it all the time.
Oh yeah, I have a question about that as well. My idea about like citation counts and stuff,
Uh-huh.
I mean, I think it's kind of important, but does it really matter that much? Like if you just look at what the person's actually saying? Like if they have like a good argument and like convincing evidence, why does it matter if they were cited 2 times?
I don't think it really matters.
Or does it in law stuff?
I mean,
When
I
you
think
filter by it.
Yeah, you can filter by it. With law, the only time that it does matter is in cases. So, like with law review articles, it doesn't matter how many times they've been cited. That doesn't change anything. But with cases, if they've been cited like 1,000 times, that means it's a really influential case. If it's never been cited, then it's not an influential case. So so like for cases, it does matter. All right. Thank you, guys.
I legit have 1% of charge on my computer.
Okay, perfect timing.
So
But
there's a single lecture every Friday.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm just gonna like you can come if you have time. It's great. We can chat, and I'll try to make the other ones more discussion based. I just wanted to sort of wrap up some things with eyewitness testimony because we were supposed to spend like 3 days on it, and we're only spending 1.
Can we do that more like in the discussions, like the future discussion? We talk about more about eyewitness testimonies.
Sure, we can talk more about eyewitness testimony, especially when we're talking about confessions, because I think there's a lot of overlap. Okay, thank you guys.
Thank you.
Okay, thank
Thank
you.
you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care.